Professor Swaran Singh, distinguished panelists and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the joint webinar of NICE and AAS on future of disarmament and nuclear arms control. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Professor Swaran Singh will be talking about AAS. To chair today's program, we have Professor Swaran Singh. Professor Swaran Singh is a professor and chair at the Center of International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is the president of Association of Asian Scholars, General Secretary of Indian Association of Asian and Pacific Studies, and visiting professor at the China West Normal University and many other esteemed institutions like Sciences Po in France, Australian National University in Canberra, and others. He is the adjunct senior fellow at the Chahar Institute, Beijing, Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, and Sichuan University, Xinjiang College. He is also on the editorial board of Asian Policy and Politics, Washington, D.C., and advisory board member of Atlanta-based Communities Without Borders, Inc., USA. He has published various articles and contributes daily on print and visual medias at home and abroad. He has written for many reputed journals like Journal of International Affairs, Columbia University, Journal of Indian Ocean Region, Perth University, and others. He also co-edited Colonial Legacies and Contemporary Studies of China and Chineseness in 2020, Corridors of Engagement in 2019, and authored Nuclear Command and Control in Southern Asia, China, India, and Pakistan in 2003, China-India Economic Engagement, Building Mutual Confidence in 2005, and others. I once again would like to welcome our chair, Professor Swaran Singh, speaker, and my good friend, Dr. Hiroaki Nakanishim, and Dr. Tong, Zhao, and all our participants. The program is streaming live on Facebook. Please do share the link on your social media so that maximum people can benefit from this lecture. Professor Swaran Singh, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramod. It's always a pleasure to work with you. I always admire your energy and enthusiasm in going online in terms of still connecting people and scholarship around the world now. We also have been doing a little bit of similar exercise at Association of Asia Scholars, which is now about 15 years of a registered society with a SAGE published journal called Millennial Asia. And like several other NGOs, we also started last year with pandemic, started online webinars and conferences. And it's a useful exercise to stay connected, and using this methodology, we were able to get people from across the world, just as you at NICE Nepal have been doing. And today we are discussing something extremely interesting to me personally, because I've been teaching issues of arms control disarmament at New Delhi's Jawaharlal Nehru University for now 20 years. But let me begin by recognizing that some of our very senior scholars have joined us. I'm not seeing all of them on my screen, so I'm not going to name names here. Let me just say thank you very much for joining this discussion today. But I can see that Professor Nirmal Jindal is on my screen. I want to acknowledge her presence here with us. As also on my screen are two of our young scholars, Kapil Patil and Rita Kumari. I have Varkha Dubey. Thank you, all of you, for joining today's discussion with us. And we look forward particularly to discussion part other than the formal presentations, because we want to make sure all the participants also have some contribution to make as to what they think on these issues, and in case they have questions, then of course speakers will be happy to answer those questions. We are also very lucky to have two very relevant perspectives on discussing the future of arms control and disarmament. One perspective from Japan, which has been a symbol of why nuclear disarmament and arms control is required, because Japan is the only country to suffer from a nuclear attack. And of course, we have a second very important perspective from China, which is increasingly seen around the world as a country that should not just participate in global nuclear disarmament deliberations, but in fact take lead in several of such initiatives. So there is both past experience of Japan and the future expectations from China, which are writ large in contemporary debates on both nuclear arms control and disarmament. Most of you are very familiar, but since in online meetings we get people from very different backgrounds, let me briefly say that arms control is a limited exercise where a certain category or certain number of certain facilitation or certain capabilities of weapon systems are aimed to be limited, which is not elimination of an entire category. Elimination of an entire physical category of nuclear weapons will be disarmament. So disarmament is elimination and arms control is only limiting certain either number of forces, number of weapons, or caliber of weapons, or how far distance they can be fired, etc., etc. So that's a simple distinction we make, because some of you who are not from this background would be surprised why are we saying future of disarmament and arms control, because they're very distinct categories in that sense. They have also become matter of concern for academics for a very simple reason, that lately at global level, arms control disarmament has faced enormous neglect, almost marginalization, particularly when it comes to nuclear disarmament and arms control. Some of you would know very well that to begin with, during George Bush Jr.'s time, anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was the very basis of strategic stability between East and West, which is Soviet Union and Russia and United States, was abandoned by both parties, United States and Soviet Union. But more recently, we saw in 2019 the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, which had eliminated, which means disarmament, a whole category of land-based missiles in Europe from both sides of the divide, East-West divide, ranging from 500 to 5,500 kilometers range, was also abandoned in 2019. And of course, 2020 created bigger crisis when Open Skies Treaty was also abandoned. So first in November, United States accused Russia and abandoned it. And of course, more recently, last month, Russia abandoned it. And that was a very significant Open Skies Treaty, because that allowed unarmed surveillance flights to go and check if all other arms control disarmament agreements signed are being implemented and complied by. The third most significant treaty that came under threat was the New START Treaty, which had put together the old 1992 START treaties and the SORT treaty of 2002 and created a new START and brought down number of weapons of United States and Russia to a very limited number of 700 launching vehicles and maximum 1,500 warheads. Now, if you look at it, the number in Cold War had gone up to 50,000 warheads. This was really very small number. And because Obama had indicated that the next step in that agreement would reduce these weapons to 1/3, is where the linkage with China had become very, very critical and integral. Because with the kind of economic rise of China and military modernization that has followed, it is clearly incumbent on any global nuclear disarmament to co-opt and engage China as well. Indeed, this New START treaty had come under threat of not being extended last Saturday, because the entire discussion that President Trump had with Beijing was a dead end, because he had two conditions. One, that he would like to extend the New START treaty between Russia and United States only if China also signs it. And second, that he will only extend it for 1 year. So negotiations had come to a dead end. And interesting part was that since the presidential campaign in the United States going on for a year had focused primarily on China and more specifically on pandemic related issues, both the candidates had nothing to offer on nuclear disarmament and arms control. And most people thought that the new start may not be extended on February 5th this year. Luckily, last Saturday, we saw the news that this is extended for 5 years because the original draft itself creates a provision for such an extension without additional ratification being required by United States Senate. So luckily, the third major agreement has been extended by 5 years, but that's a temporary arrangement. The challenges that countries continue to face today at the global level is that global arms control and disarmament must, as I just said, co-opt and engage China and make China as part and parcel of future initiatives. But also look at other categories. What about non-strategic weapons? For example, New START looks at strategic weapons. What about smaller category, smaller range weapons, non-nuclear weapons of a whole range of kinds which are increasingly becoming dangerous? These could be anti-satellite weapons, these could be cyber security related issues, these could be cruise missiles, these could be all kinds of issues that also need to be brought into this global focus on arms control and disarmament. So it's not just an additional country, China, but also a whole lot of additional categories of drones, of UAVs, which also are becoming increasingly so dangerous that you need a global regime. And of course, global nuclear convention also is something that has recently been signed, which is another good sign. So there is a little over the horizon optimism that one can notice, but that optimism is still very limited based on conventional wisdom and conventional institutions. They are not as yet covering the futuristic challenges which I just mentioned. So in that sense, there are enormous challenges that lay ahead in terms of how great nations have to begin to conceptualize global arms control and disarmament. And in that sense, I think co-option of China, and we are lucky to have Dr. Zhao speaking to us today, is very, very game-changing kind of expectation that we have. And that's very interesting also because in 2012, President Obama had for the first time initiated, other than his nuclear security summits, he had initiated the P5 summit meetings for arms control and disarmament. Now, China is perfectly happy to join the P5 group of such an enterprise. But China, as yet, I'm waiting if Dr. Zhao will correct me on this, China as yet is reluctant to either accept G2 arrangements or G3 arrangements, which means Russia, United States, China for nuclear disarmament, arms control is not something that is an acceptable template to Beijing as of now. Beijing is happy to go and sit in P5 negotiations. So some of these are issues that need to be really resolved so that a holistic and a far more energetic focus on arms control and disarmament could move forward, and states could get back the initiative. And my last point before I give the floor to two speakers is how global arms control and disarmament for about 3 decades has moved away from state actors to non-state actors. The last important treaty signed in the Conference on Disarmament, which is a United Nations organ, was in 1993, the Chemical Weapons Convention. No major treaty since then has been signed in those international structures. So states are not supposed to be delivering on the promise of pursuing arms control and disarmament. Meanwhile, Nobel laureates, civil society, NGOs, INGOs, media, retired politicians, they have become far more active in, for example, bringing about arms control treaty or anti-landmine ban treaty or the cluster bomb ban treaty. So many of these other arms control disarmament has happened because of contributions of what I broadly call non-state actors. So initiative has to come back to major powers. Initiative has to involve China as a major contributor to the future trends. And the initiatives in arms control disarmament have to look at several other sectors, areas, and challenges, which also need to be addressed in designing the future arms control and disarmament. And I think that is what makes us particularly look at relatively younger scholars who always think out of box. And we have two very brilliant upcoming scholars on issues of arms control and disarmament. I will first invite Hiroaki-san, who was a long time back my student at master's class in Jawaharlal Nehru University. So I am always delighted to see him, and I have watched his progress over a period of time. But of course, Hiroaki-san is currently the postdoctoral fellow at the Graduate Institute for Asian and African Studies at a very beautiful Kyoto University. I remember in 2013, he had completed his PhD. Very interesting because it is on transformation of India's nuclear policy in the post-Cold War era. He's also meanwhile had experience of working with UN Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in Asia and Pacific. And of course, he's also worked with the Policy Research Division of Japan's Atomic Energy Agency, as also with the MOFA, with Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His interest has constantly remained on issues of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation, which includes his works on NPT, on New START Treaty, on INF, on IAEA safeguards, nuclear energy, the Iran nuclear deal, and of course, Japan, India, and US civil nuclear energy cooperation agreements, etc., etc. So extremely delighted that he has spent much of his energies not just on arms control disarmament research, but also on India in that sense. So we are delighted to have him today. In fact, he's the one who's coordinated this entire program for today's evening discussion. So with that, I invite Hiroaki-san to make his initial presentations between 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will open it up to the second speaker and then question answer session. And the floor is yours now, Hiroaki-san.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Swaran Singh, for your kind introduction on me. I'm delighted to be participate in today's brilliant, excellent webinar. So, can you hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Thank you so much for having this wonderful event happen. That was my request, but you and the others actually accepted. Thank you very much. Especially this webinar was happened in one of the prestigious research institute, NICE, in Nepal. Thank you. Specifically, I must thank Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, and NICE research director, and you, of course, Professor Swaran Singh. Also, thank you, Dr. Tong, Zhao, Senior Fellow, Nuclear Policy Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Carnegie Tinfa Center for Global Policy, China. Even though today is in the middle of Chinese New Year, thank you. You spare your precious time to join our today's webinar. I would like to hear and discuss your creative nuclear arms proposal together later on. Added to this, just Professor Swaran Singh kindly introduced, I used to work at the UNRCPD, Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in Asia and Pacific as UN volunteer. So Nepal is one of my important part of my life. For me personally, Nepal locates at the center of today's regional nuclear arms control and disarmament endeavors. So I'm glad to have this event in Nepal again. Thank you. So let's move on to my presentation part. So today we are facing long-term stagnation in nuclear arms control and disarmament. That is because the deteriorating international security environment and divisions, huge divisions, I think, over how to proceed with nuclear arms control and disarmament cast a shadow, actually. Even so, as already Professor Swaran Singh actually explained, the only remaining nuclear arms control and disarmament treaty, that is the New START treaty, was successfully extended for a maximum of 5 years under the new US President Joe Biden. So that news actually gives us a hope, and it allows us to seek and design more ambitious but realistic nuclear arms control and disarmament framework, which cover not only the Indo-Pacific regions, but also the world. And also more creative and effective nuclear arms control and disarmament measures, including disarmament and non-proliferation education, the capacity building for the next generations, realizing a world without nuclear weapons. So I would like to inform you that as an important bridge building effort of nuclear arms control and disarmament, actually I'm currently working on realizing Indo-Pacific Conference on Arms Control and Regional Security Conference, Regional Security in the Yokosuka, Japan, and also 28th UN Conference on Disarmament Issues, back to back the before mentioned Indo-Pacific Conference. Ideally to be held before the coming NPT review conference in August, and during the Tokyo Olympic Games to be held from late July to August, and also Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Memorial ceremonies this year. So utilizing tremendous opportunities to invite world leaders, specifically the US President Joe Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden. She is a great US educator, it's well known. Them to Japan and facilitating nuclear arms control disarmament non-proliferation effort, including educational capacity building effort toward the world without nuclear weapons. Would like to talk about the detail of this event I'm proposing later on. So I'm very much excited to have today's webinar, and it would be a stimulus moving away toward a world without nuclear weapons forward. So for today's event, I would like to discuss 2 points. First, for nuclear arms control, I would like to talk about how to breach nuclear weapon states to pursue further nuclear arms control and disarmament, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region. And second, for nuclear disarmament, I talk about how to breach divergent approaches over nuclear arms control and disarmament, realizing a world without nuclear weapons. So first, in the proposing Indo-Pacific Conference on Arms Control Regional Security Issues in Yokosuka, I believe that topics of how we can unite to heal and build our nuclear arms control and disarmament architectures and concrete measures back better. In other words, how to restore and rebuild lost momentum of nuclear arms control and disarmament and lost architectures, as Professor Swaran Singh mentions, such as INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and Open Skies Treaty, and also several action plans mentioned in the final document of respective NPT review conferences agree with the nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. So this time, let me briefly touch upon my ideas of nuclear arms control, specifically how to rebuild the post-INF treaty in a trilateral or regional or global setting. So I would like to argue a possibility that creating a regional, say Indo-Pacific INF treaty framework, which include China and other stakeholders in the regions. Although you might think this idea is very minor and neither convincing, attracting, perhaps if you are a TPLW supporter, you might be a little bit disappointed to hear I don't to know that I'm not talking about TPNW issue from me. But don't worry, I will touch upon this aspect as well later in my presentation. So if you look outside of our regions in the Pacific, for instance, recently, the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg calls to adapt nuclear arms control regimes to new realities, specifically the necessity of finding a way to include China in a post-INF architecture. And also in the short term, working with China on transparency and the predictability for controls over intermediate nuclear weapons. So that is his proposal. On the other hand, Russia offers moratorium deployment of global ground-based intermediate range ballistic missiles, specifically in the East Asian Summit last year. Also, NATO member states rejected the offer, Russian offer, but I believe it is worth revisiting the Russian idea as well. Added to this, reflecting the new reality that the inauguration of the Biden administration's and the 5-year extension of NPT, New START treaty, many scholars now start to talk about rebuilding INF framework, especially in the Europe now, and also how to make China be involved in further nuclear arms control with an idea of INF framework. So discussing such a possibility, especially the restoring or rebuilding INF, is not strange things at all today. So it is, however, fair to say that China might not be interested in, or at least not yet ready to negotiate or discuss a formal arms control disarmament framework, especially together with US and Russia, or even within the P5 framework, or together with other stakeholders such as NATO and Indo-Pacific countries, such as India, Pakistan, and other non-nuclear weapon states such as Japan, Australia, ROK. In the trilateral context, many scholars experts mentioned that China might be negative to further nuclear arms control negotiations due to a significant disparity of their nuclear forces with US and Russia, or forcible disincentives to negotiate to reduce and limit their comparative advantages in nuclear forces to the US and Russia. In this regard, we should think of how we can incentivize and socialize China for joining further nuclear arms control and disarmament architectures and effort. My tentative idea of necessary steps for realizing a regional, say, Indo-Pacific INF treaty framework, which includes China, is the following. First step for implementing perhaps the decade phase limitation and reductions measures toward a complete ban of intermediate range nuclear forces is that backed by strict verification monitoring on-site inspection mechanism, at least the US, Russia, and China limit, use, and develop the dual capability of ground-based intermediate range nuclear forces, which might cause unintended escalatory and accidental use of nuclear weapons in combat. That is my idea, say, as a ban on nuclear-armed intermediate range ballistic and cruise missiles. Such arrangement could eliminate danger that a side misinterpret a launch of a conventionally armed missile to be nuclear-armed one in terms of reducing the nuclear dangers and the risk. In the real context of the Indo-Pacific regions, as for China's nuclear forces, the use of land-based anti-ship ballistic missile, which with the dual capabilities such as the F-26, called as an aircraft carrier killer. Although I'm not sure whether it is really used to destroy an aircraft carrier in the real scenario, but it should be concerned to be used in the flashpoint in the Pacific region, such as South China Sea, Taiwan, and Senkaku Island. So at least we can unite to eliminate a catastrophic nuclear nightmare scenario. That would be a mutual beneficial first step for nuclear arms control and disarmament. So such a step can contribute to enhancing mutual trust and confidence and minimize risk of military conflicts, and eventually be culminated into a more ambitious INF Treaty framework, might be, say, global INF Treaty framework. Furthermore, as a credible verification for a ban of nuclear-armed intermediate-range ballistic and cruise missiles, the side may work on appropriate measures to monitor and count the number of intermediate-range missiles and the absence of nuclear warfare at the declared facilities for such missiles. So for intermediate-range missile considerations, there are other important steps to reduce nuclear dangers, risks, and the load of nuclear weapons, but also to enhance strategic stability among the nuclear weapon states. So for instance, first, all nuclear weapon states make a declaration that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So which is the sole conviction made by Reagan and Gorbachev in the Cold War era when the INF Treaty was signed. And second, that can pave a way for a possible US move to the sole purpose nuclear deterrence, which was not materialized in the previous Obama presidency era. Because one of the President Biden's nuclear arms control plan is to put the belief of sole purpose deterrence into practice. So that can be totally compatible as a practical step for it if the dual capability aspect of deterrence was successfully regulated. And third, strategic stability dialogues to discuss necessary confidence and security building measures. For instance, discussion of nuclear doctrine of each state, specifically the compatibility of the dual capability with the NFU, non-first use doctrine, and also missile launch and exercise notifications, and discussion of space and cyber domains, and if possible, emerging and modern military technologies such as hypersonic technologies. These topics mentioned above might make up a good agenda for initial US-Chinese strategic stability talks, or trilateral talks, or multilateral settings, such as the 1.5 track meeting, like the Indo-Pacific Conference and the UN Conference on Disarmament issue in Japan, which I'm proposing. Specifically, why Yokosuka is very important part for my proposal. So Yokosuka located in the Kanagawa Prefecture, Japan, where the famous city has a Japanese self-defense forces and the US Navy base. Specifically, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier named former US President Ronald Reagan. So Yokosuka would be a desirable place to initiate a dialogue toward a world without nuclear weapons, for my understanding, and to also to make international peace and security and regional security of the Indo-Pacific less confrontational and more cooperative for a common good and aim. So I should mention the fact that US President Joe Biden is the exact person who led the INF Treaty negotiation in the US side. So I'm counting on the President Biden for his participation in this conference in Japan, if possible. And he will tell us about history, culture, and new hopes of nuclear arms control and disarmament for us. So we should think big always. So I also must mention that if such an INF framework has been established in the medium or long term, it may have a greater global impact to other regions, South Asia, for instance, China, India, Pakistan, or Indo-China-US triangles, and the Middle East, for instance, Iran, JCPOA, or the nuclearization of DPRK. Perhaps it might bring good synergy with creation of remaining regional nuclear weapon-free zones, for instance, Middle East nuclear weapon-free zones, which was allegedly the cause of failure of the 2015 NPT review conference. So another important point is socializing arms control and disarmament culture. So not only China, even the UK and France have not enough experience to be involved in actual nuclear arms control measures. So such as TCBMs, verification, monitoring, on-site inspections, and dismantlement measures, which are needed for realizing a world without nuclear weapons. So we should intensify our global effort of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation education and capacity building aimed at fulfilling the goal that in the context of China, the US, Russia may invite China for socializing and capacity building, especially for arms control and disarmament measures, for instance, possible data exchange under the New START treaty framework. So let us move on to my second point of presentation, that is how to bridge divergent approaches over the nuclear arms control and disarmament. So realizing a world without nuclear weapons.
Hiroaki-san, you can take Hiroaki-san. You can take two more minutes.
Okay, I understand. The key is disarmament and non-proliferation education, the capacity building toward a world without nuclear weapons. So as I mentioned before, for multilateralizing, socializing nuclear arms control and disarmament, especially and such culture, the nuclear weapon states and its allies need nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation education, and capacity building effort, even in implementing a regional INF treaty framework. So not surprisingly to me, but even the TPNW share the same common agenda, because we should think of how to reduce nuclear dangers, risk, and the load of nuclear weapons, and also how to build the capacity of designing and implementing necessary arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation measures for building necessary human, technological, scientific, institutional, financial resources for building necessary creative, effective, and sustainable method in order to realize a world without nuclear weapons. There might therefore be a point of convergence for the nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, and TPNW supporters. In my personal view, even the TPNW sides should think of banning intermediate range nuclear forces, for instance. So there is again, there is really the point of convergence. So in this regard, I'm proposing additional event meeting in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, desirably together with US First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, to talk about necessary nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation education, and capacity building for next generations as a bridge building agenda toward a world without nuclear weapons. At least we can discuss some practical aspects in the area, such as how to direct existing architectures asset and global effort, specifically that of the IAEA, CTBTO, and IPNDB, etc., can be effectively rearranged, advanced, and directed to fulfilling the goal. On this point, I'm counting on the UN regional offices such as UNRCPD or UNITAR Hiroshima and other civil society organizations, universities, research institutions, and not last but not least, respective government, which are stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific regions. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. I really look forward to exchange a view with you later. Now I would like to pass my baton to Dr. Zhao for his presentation from Chinese perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiroaki-san. You had a long list of propositions. I'm sure many of them will come for discussion, but let me now move to our next speaker. Zhao is a senior fellow now at Carnegie Center for Global Policy in Beijing. But two things I particularly felt so impressed when I was looking at his introduction. He's a member of International Fissile Material Committee, in which one of my colleagues also sits. So I was delighted to see that he's member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. but he's also holding several other positions. Tung Zhao is a member of board of directors of Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. He's also the board member of Missile Dialogue Initiative and also associate editor of the Journal of Science and Global Security. He's been previously, some of you may have recently applied for the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellowship at Harvard University. He's formerly fellow of that program and also a non-resident WSD Handa Fellow at the Pacific Forum. And of course, he's also worked with the Beijing Municipality's Foreign Affairs Office. He holds a PhD from Georgia Tech in Science, Technology, and International Affairs. Before that, he did his BS and Masters in International Relations from Tsinghua University. Among several things that he has authored already include Tides of Change, China's Nuclear, Ballistic Missile, Submarines, and Strategic Stability, and another very interesting paper on narrowing the US-China gap on missile defense. So I'm sure we are all looking forward to listening to Tung Chao Kosh as to what he has to say in terms of where China can and will take the global arms control and disarmament discourses. He's had enormous experience of working both inside think tanks and government and in other institutions of global reputation. So we are all looking forward to hearing his views on what he thinks is happening to the future of arms control and disarmament. And then we want to keep some time for question answers and other interventions on the floor. With that, let me request Dr. Zhao to begin his initial remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Singh, for your very kind introduction. I must apologize first for being late at the beginning because I messed up with the time difference between Beijing and Nepal. I thought it was a 2 hour 30 minutes difference, but it is in fact a 2 hour 15 minutes difference. So my sincere apologies. Going back to my presentation, looking at the global arms control landscape, certainly it was very good news that US and Russia was able to renew the New START treaty. However, that doesn't mean that the future implementation of the treaty will be problems free. Because Russia has raised issues with some American practices of implementation of the treaty, including the way the US has converted some of the previously nuclear-armed missiles into conventional ones. So if the political relationship between Moscow and Washington goes bad again in the future, it's totally possible that Russia will again raise those issues and create obstacles for the future of the New START treaty. And during the Trump administration, the US has withdrawn from the Open Skies Treaty. The INF Treaty was also ended. There is no guarantee that the Biden administration is able to re-enter the Open Skies Treaty. And with all the development of new medium range and intermediate range land-based missiles in the United States and Russia, the future of restoring the INF Treaty is also very uncertain. But the most challenging issue between the US and Russia is whether the two countries can start negotiating the next round of strategic nuclear arms treaty to follow up with the New START treaty after the New START expires in 2026. The two countries will have to address a number of very hard issues, including the issue of missile defense, non-strategic nuclear weapons, etc. Those are not easy problems to resolve. So that adds another layer of uncertainty to the future of arms control between US and China, between US and Russia. Now it comes to the issue of how to include China into future arms control. Indeed, China has become a key player that affects the US-Russia bilateral nuclear arms control process. According to American government officials, China may double the number of its nuclear weapons within the next decade. Whether that prediction is accurate or not, it is true that China is modernizing its nuclear forces in a very comprehensive manner. So there is no question that China's nuclear arsenal will continue growing into the future. I think there are at least 5 main challenges to bring China into a broader arms control regime. The first is the serious distrust between China and the United States at the political level. Most Chinese experts in Beijing has drawn a very firm conclusion that the United States is determined to undermine China because the US is a declining power, China is a rising power, and this shifting balance of power ensures that the US will have every interest to prevent China from rising. So, and also the ideological differences between the two countries become more salient over time. So that ideological competition also makes trust between the two countries at the political level very hard to build. And without political trust, it is hard to carry out arms control negotiations. It is hard to convince China that it is safe to become more transparent on its nuclear capabilities, or it is safe for China to make promises on self-restraint of its nuclear capability development. The second challenge is that among many Chinese experts, they generally embrace a very power-centric mindset, which means many Chinese experts see the international system as an anarchical system. It is ruled by the jungle's law. Their perception is China has been treated unfairly by the US and other Western powers, and the West embraces inherent bias and prejudice against China, and their reasoning is the key factor influencing and causing the Western so-called bias and prejudice against China is the weak Chinese capability. If China becomes more powerful in terms of comprehensive national power, the West would have to drop their bias and would have to respect China. That's the main perception among the Chinese experts community. And with that type of mindset, the general belief is it's not time for China to slow down its development of military power. In fact, China needs to speed up the development of its comprehensive national power, including military power. So that mindset works against the prospect for China to join a broader arms control regime. The third main challenge is the lack of capacity. Compared with US and Russia, China has much less experience negotiating and implementing nuclear arms reduction treaties. And if you talk with Chinese experts, you can often hear this argument that if China is to negotiate an arms control agreement with the United States, which has a much larger nuclear arsenal, it is impossible for China to get a fair bargain it is impossible for China to be treated equally and fairly in this negotiation simply because Chinese power is weaker. And with a more advanced technological capability, the bigger party, the United States, would be able to cheat and violate its obligations without being detected. But China, as a weaker party, will have to carry out all the obligations and the treaty. So, according to this view, an arms control treaty between a stronger and a weaker party, by definition, favors the stronger party. So there is no trust that arms control treaty can be made fair by including, for example, a very robust verification regime. The Chinese experts don't share the confidence held by many American and Russian experts that adequately designed verification regime can ensure compliance of the treaty by all parties without creating excessive security risks by exposing too much military secrets and sensitive information. So there is no appreciation of the value and effectiveness of verification regime. And as a result, there is little trust of whether arms control treaty can be made workable between a stronger and a weaker party. The fourth main challenge is brought about by new technologies. As we know that today, a country's nuclear weapons are vulnerable, not only to the enemy's nuclear weapons, but also to a wide range of non-nuclear military technologies, including missile defense, conventional precision-guided weapons, cyber technologies, which can, in theory, penetrate and interfere with a country's nuclear command control system, space-based sensors that can detect and track land mobile nuclear missile launchers, and even autonomous weapon technologies, including unmanned underwater vessels, can be used to detect and track nuclear submarines in the ocean. So all these non-nuclear technologies are making nuclear weapons much more vulnerable than before. So how do we factor in the impact of these conventional and non-nuclear technologies in the nuclear equation? There is no easy solution, and that's a major challenge. And the fifth and last challenge is caused by third-party players. Between US and China, North Korea, or DPRK, is a very important third-party player. In fact, after the recently concluded 8th Party Congress of DPRK, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, has made a very clear point that North Korea is going to continue developing better nuclear technologies and building more nuclear weapons. With that, the US will feel a lot of pressure to continue improving its missile defense capabilities. But the growing American missile defense capability is going to really motivate China to build more nuclear weapons and better nuclear capabilities. So the North Korean is really destabilizing the nuclear equation between China and the United States by causing greater incentive for US to strengthen missile defense, and then to cause greater incentive in China to build up its nuclear forces to counter American missile defense. So how to address the impact of North Korea's growing nuclear capability is also going to affect whether China would be interested in US-China or a multilateral arms control regime. And looking forward, I think despite all these challenges, there are a few things that can be done to help mitigate this problem. I will briefly mention 4. One is, I think, the major powers, including China, they can reach a shared understanding first about what arms control cooperation can achieve. For many people, arms control means a radical reduction of nuclear weapons. That is not going to happen. in the near-term future, if we are talking about arms control cooperation with China. But if you are talking about using arms control to manage the increasingly intensive arms competition among the major powers, I think there is a lot of room for cooperation. Things can be done to ensure that the arms competition between US and China can be made less costly and less dangerous. And if that common sense or joint understanding can be established, that will pave the ground for greater political interest in arms control cooperation. And second, although it is very hard to initiate arms reduction cooperation in the near-term future, it's very hard it's very hard for China to start cutting its nuclear weapons. But I think China, US, and Russia, all the major nuclear powers, including the UK and France, and others, India, for example, Pakistan, they all have a shared interest in preventing nuclear accidents and in preventing any accidents from inadvertently escalating into a nuclear conflict. So to jointly manage conventional military crises and to work towards crisis, preventing inadvertent escalation of crises is, I think, a major priority for the near-term future. And in this regard, many nuclear weapon states are currently introducing dual-capable missile systems. That is causing much greater risks of misunderstanding and overreaction in a conventional conflict. So they can work together to think about the potential risks of nuclear conventional entanglement and dual-capable missile systems. And maybe they can reach a joint understanding of refraining from introducing and deploying such weapon systems. And thirdly, I think in order to promote arms control cooperation, we need to address the capability asymmetry among the major powers. As it was already mentioned, China has a much smaller nuclear arsenal than US and Russia, but there are creative ways that we can come up with to address this asymmetry. One possible option to do so from an academic perspective is to combine the New START Treaty with the INF Treaty. If we count all land-based missiles with ranges greater than 500 kilometers, plus submarine-launched ballistic missiles, plus heavy bombers, we reach a very interesting situation. That is, all the three major powers, US and Russia and China, they all each have about 600 or so launchers of these weapons. So I think that's a good way to include China in a trilateral arms control regime so that China can be an equal partner with the United States and Russia in conducting arms control cooperation. So I think this possible option of combining New START Treaty and the INF Treaty offers a good opportunity for multilateral nuclear arms control in the future. Of course, this is a very preliminary idea. It's not perfect, but if scholars and experts can start debating and examining the pros and cons of such options, I think that would be a good start to build confidence and trust. And lastly, I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of engagement at the leadership level. For countries like China, the decision-making system is increasingly centralized. So it is highly important that Chinese top leadership, especially the president, to support the concept of arms control. If there is support from the top political level, then there will be a lot of interest within the bureaucracy at the operational level to think about arms control options. If there is no support from top level officials, then the bureaucracy has little incentive to even consider arms control options. So in that regard, I think arms control symmetry or some top leadership engagement, some personal interactions between the national leaders to directly discuss arms control issues would be a very good way to inject momentum into multilateral arms control cooperation. The overall observation I would offer is there are many challenges today for maintaining the US-Russian bilateral arms control cooperation and for bring about a multilateral nuclear arms control. But we cannot afford doing nothing because the nuclear risks are indeed rising in many corners of the world. And the increasingly intensive arms competition among the major powers are becoming more dangerous. So I have tried to offer a few measures that may help mitigate this problem and build confidence in the near term. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay. So we had Dr. Zhao presenting the 5 limitations of how China can be co-opted into the global or trilateral process of arms control and disarmament. And he then shared with us the 4 future ways of pursuing arms control and disarmament such that China can actually play a significant role. But you would also remember, I saw that both Hiroaki-san and Dr. Zhao overlap in recommending regional level initiatives, or at least including regional level initiatives into the global initiatives. Whereas Hiroaki-san mentioned a regional level INF arrangement, Dr. Zhao mentioned of combining New START with INF arrangements. But I was noticing that Hiroaki-san had mentioned about trust building as the force, the method in pursuing even regional level disarmament initiatives or arms control initiatives. And he had used a very interesting expression of socializing China into arms control and disarmament. And then, of course, he mentioned 2 other things. One, that there could be commitment at the level of politicians or leaders, which could at least agree on what Reagan and Gorbachev had already underlined, that nuclear wars cannot be won and therefore must not be fought. And so in principle, that kind of arrangement could be made. Like Dr. Zhao mentioned, summit meetings being an important method. We heard Hiroaki-san also talking about strategic dialogues as a method, and he gave a specific example of starting with no first use as a principle that could be adopted, and several other issues were raised, but let me not take too much time. As the participants prepare to make their intervention or ask questions, I will request them to switch on their videos so that I can see them on my screen, and also raise electronic hand, just as Dr. Kushkumar Gayasan has already raised an electronic hand. So if you are able to raise an e-hand is good, otherwise a physical hand also I should be able to see. I have noted that there's another request. I can't see the name. It says Nice Nepal. We'll come to you very quickly, but let me first request Professor Nirmal Jindal to briefly make our intervention before I ask others to also make interventions.
Thank you very much. Very insightful presentations after a long time. I got to hear wonderful presentations on future of nuclear disarmament because when I was a student of international politics and I was a student of strategic studies, I was involved in all these studies, and then our concept of disarmament and our concept of arms control and all those things we had been studying and we have been deliberating on. So for the latest situation, we are focusing on China. It is very interesting to hear that we have to get into the multilateral. I mean, the idea is to involve China in the arms control talks. But my submission over here, my concern over here, so far I understand, the main threat to the Asian region comes from the horizontal proliferation, because after the end of Cold War, though the vertical proliferation had slowed down, of course, China is coming up with nuclear weapons, and the number game, that the kind of game that US and USSR had been indulged during the Cold War period, similar kind of race maybe China will get involved in. So here, my concern is that how China can contribute towards stopping the clandestine supply of nuclear materials and technologies to some of the countries, smaller countries, or, those countries which cannot afford to have command control, communication, intelligence kind of systems, to maintain stability, security. I mean, how China can contribute to nuclear non-proliferation at horizontal level. My second question is that the significance of deterrence, the importance of the significance of deterrence, of the traditional kind of deterrence and conventional kind of deterrence. The deterrence when you had, the enemy is clear cut, it is present in front of you. I mean, that kind of significance also deterrence is losing in view of the rising non-state actors. If nuclear proliferation takes place, and in future, if some non-state actors get hold of these, nuclear technologies and nuclear weapons or crude kind of weapons, they can use these against, any of the countries. So that danger may not be that enormous or that devastating as it happens in the nuclear wars, but still they can cause, serious danger. So my concern is the new kind of proliferation that is taking place at the horizontal level. How, China can contribute towards that. Thank you very much for wonderful presentation, and thank you very much, Professor Swaran Singh, for sharing the link with me and enabled me to participate in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Jindal. I hope you will stay with us till the end. Let me now request Dr. Kushkumar Gaison, then Kapil Patil, and I see only a name of Nice Nepal. Sir, I don't know your name, so you'll be the third to ask the question. Kush, please go ahead very quickly, and Kapil next.
Sure. Thank you, sir. I'm really delighted to see China, Japan, and India, and also Nepal on the same platform. And so my question is about North Korea's nuclear weapons program, particularly the six-party talks. So I would like to know from both our speakers what kind of role China can play, or Japan can play, to revive the six-party talks, in particular, or overall, to resolve the North Korean nuclear programs in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Since China and Japan both sit on six-party talks, that's an interesting question. Kapil, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, sir. And very briefly, good evening, everyone. One question to Dr. Zhao, and then one to Hiroaki-san. Dr. Zhao, you have talked about the possible solutions of, or some sort of mitigation measures to address the current, issues of arms control. I'd like to ask you, or to sort of, draw from Professor Swaran Singh's initial remarks about the new technologies that are emerging, which are not just very destabilizing. For instance, the vulnerabilities in the cyberspace, and then the whole new technologies like AI and robotics, which are sort of introducing that element of autonomy and making humans out of the loop, so thereby increasing the risk, the which are far more destabilizing to sort of speak, and needs to be sort of factored into the arms control discussion. So what is Chinese perspective as far as the risk reduction vis-a-vis the emerging technology is concerned? How are they looking at it? And other question to Hiroaki is that although Japan is talking about whole host of initiatives, including the one, Indo-Pacific INF and so on and so forth, and rightly so, because this year we are gearing up for the nuclear non-proliferation, the review conference. So, and there is also ban treaty which is gaining a lot of traction. So Japan naturally is under a lot of pressure, being a non-signatory to ban treaty. But on the other hand, Japan faces a considerable, what should I say, uh, the threat from China is also prominent. In a sense, the whole Asian balance of power now has gone into disarray, especially with Trump administration withdrawing its commitment to allies. So, and with Biden administration, this South Korean and Japanese are increasingly looking at America to restore the pivot to Asia. So do you see some sort of tension in the in the Japanese approach vis-a-vis arms control in the Asian region? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now request a senior gentleman. I'm sorry, sir, I can't see your name here. So may I request you to please unmute and make your intervention.
Okay. Good evening to everybody. And actually, my name is Niranjan Man Singh Basnat. I am the former ambassador of Nepal to Malaysia, and this is, the nuclear disarmament is my area of interest. So I have been keeping it, informed myself about all these, what is happening. And now I am the president of Lumbini Research Center for Understanding and Peace. So we had celebrated on the 22nd of January this year, last month. We have celebrated from Lumbini the entry into force of TPNW. So now I hear all the experts' views about all sorts of nuclear weapons delivery systems and all these things. So as a peace activist, actually I am not interested in those some sorts of things, but I was very happy about entry into force of the this TPNW. And I think we have to have a similar program regarding the difficulty in implementing TPNW. Actually, TPNW, after the 50th ratifications, so now become an international law. And in total, whether they are ready to dismantle their all the weapons or not. That is a big challenge now, because we cannot restrict to certain regions, certain Asia, Latin America, Africa. We have surpassed that situation. So my question is, what will be the challenges for implementing TPNW in the days ahead, in the years ahead? It might take decades. So it is my question to both the experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. TPNW is a very interesting new achievement where countries that hold nuclear weapons are out of it. So in that sense, it's a normatively strong kind of pious, sentimental agreement so far, because it lacks the teeth in that sense of either implementing what it wants to implement or getting those countries who have nuclear weapons sign and ratify it. I will now request my speakers to respond to these four interventions before we go to the next set of questions. Since several questions were directed to Dr. Thung Chao, before I ask Dr. Hiroaki Nakanishi to speak, I'll request Dr. Chao to answer these questions and respond.
Thank you so much. There was a question about horizontal nuclear proliferation and how can China stop clandestine supply of nuclear materials and technologies to other countries. Based on my open source research, I don't think China is still providing illegal nuclear materials and technologies to other countries. And I think China has become aware of the risks of proliferation. I don't think China is interested in those activities, even though China certainly has a history that is more controversial regarding its track record of non-proliferation. I think the most important challenge today is how to prevent further horizontal proliferation, including possible pursuit of independent nuclear capabilities by countries like South Korea, or even Japan, or Saudi Arabia, Turkey, etc., if the North Korean nuclear issue and the Iranian nuclear issue cannot be adequately addressed. There is the question of the significance of deterrence. Traditionally, the enemy is clear-cut, but now we have rising non-state actors. Again, I think to prevent non-state actors from accessing nuclear weapons or nuclear materials technologies, we may need considering to resurrect the nuclear security efforts that were promoted by President Obama. I think those efforts are most effective in strengthening nuclear security and preventing non-state actors from accessing loose nuclear materials or even weapons. For the question of North Korea and six-party talks, what role can China play? I think my personal assessment is North Korea has zero interest in giving up its nuclear weapons, and the international community has no real leverage to force North Korea to disarm. So we may have to face the reality of a nuclear-capable North Korea and to deal with it. Realistically, what can be done for the near term, I think, is to reach a near-term and interim deal with North Korea to freeze or at least cap North Korea's nuclear program, to prevent North Korea's nuclear capability from further growing. I think some quid pro quos can be made between North Korea and other major powers to make that happen. And China can certainly play a role in that effort. Because of the time limitation, I wouldn't be able to go into details, but would be happy to discuss offline. In terms of the impact of new technologies, what's the Chinese perspective of risk reduction, especially when it comes to new technologies? I think China is aware of the potential risks introduced by new military technologies. China has been calling on all the major powers to jointly study the risks from new technologies. I think the more important question is whether China can join other countries in putting real limit on the development and even deployment of new technologies. I think that's a much harder question. And today, we haven't seen much real discussion within China about whether China should accept constraint on the development of new technologies. China is like every other nuclear power, is very much interested in the military potential of these military technologies. It requires, I think, a long process of confidence building before China is willing to submit itself to substantive constraints on such development. In terms of the TPNW, China's traditional position is, China has developed nuclear weapons in order to promote nuclear disarmament. So the ultimate goal of Chinese nuclear weapons, according to traditional Chinese position, is to facilitate global nuclear disarmament. But I think over time, after decades of investing into the nuclear enterprise, I don't think any Chinese expert is still seriously interested in promoting nuclear disarmament. So in order to encourage China to think more deeply and seriously about nuclear disarmament, I think more appeals from other parties, from other countries globally will certainly be useful. And also, China has basically been arguing that any issue of nuclear disarmament should be discussed within the framework of P5. But P5 is basically a small, P5 is an effort that the nuclear weapon states can work together to fend off the pressure from the rest of the international community on nuclear disarmament. So if we leave everything to the P5 conference, I don't think we are going to see serious progress towards disarmament. Again, I think the international community should call on the P5 to produce substantive progress. They shouldn't be allowed to only discussing nuclear glossary or the impact of new technologies. They should be forced to produce concrete results in terms of nuclear reduction and their roadmap for nuclear disarmament. Without that pressure, it's hard to imagine that a P5 process will be able to generate real progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhao. I think you, me, and Ambassador share that sentiment of how civil society can play an increasing role in bringing the pressure on major powers to, as you said, showcase some progress. Let me now request Dr. Nakanishi. Please, among several questions, you had a question on what Japan can contribute to reviving six-party talks and making it effective, and also TPNW. What is your view and how do you see the future of TPNW?
Thank you. Unmute, right? Yeah. Okay. So thank you for your questions. Very interesting point. Of course, those are very much, linked with the Japanese nuclear disarmament diplomacy and policies. Regarding TPNW, of course, there are many discussion is in Japan going on. Of course, whether Japanese government should, participate the TPNW first plenary meeting, conference party, meeting, as a observer or not. So this kind of discussion is very lively. So just yesterday, there was a discussion, like live stream webinar among several parliamentarians discuss about this issue. So discussion is very lively. I believe that personally, I believe the TPNW has still lots of problems to be accepted by Japan, Japanese government, because if you think of the security aspect, so TPNW have lots of problems. Not problems, it means like lots of gaps in the security assurances. So this point should be sorted out, or should be discussed in depth, so that like a kind of gaps could be fulfilled. And also, I'm not sure whether Japanese government should participate in the TPNW meeting observer status or not, because there's already many venues like NPT review conference, other venues. Perhaps TPNW's venue is very limited to be discussed, among the nuclear weapon states, with the nuclear weapon states and other non-nuclear weapon states, especially like new U.S. allies, like NATO countries. Even NATO, in the framework of NATO, there are differences. That over how to think of the TPNW in their security strategies. But I believe even so, as I presented, there might be a convergent point. of course, like some nuclear weapon states and some other non-nuclear weapon states cannot support TPNW directly. Perhaps this country is difficult to provide the financial resources to implement the obligation of TPNW or a capacity building to implement TPNW obligation directly. But as I mentioned, there are already, so many nuclear arms control disarmament machineries are established, like a CTBT, IAEA. Perhaps indirect way in the TPNW meeting, perhaps IAEA or CTBT people can be invited to discuss about how they can bridge their capacity building project or technological development kind of things. Of course, I mean, the development of the national regulations or the capacity to implement can be discussed in the venue. Then perhaps some indirect way TPNW, non-TPNW supporter can bridge implement some sort of similar obligations or approach, I mean, some measures in the another, treaties or instrument. So then that is why I'm suggesting to have this, kind of meeting, not necessarily in the TPNW structures, perhaps as a separate venue to discuss about how to reallocate the resources of existing projects to implement the TPNWs and the obligations similarly exist in the NPT and TPNW or other relevant treaty and instrument. So that is my suggestions. That can be possible to be discussed and implemented. So that is why I'm very much believe this potential. So
Thank you.
yeah. So
Yeah,
in the
thank you. You want to also say something on six-party talks very quickly?
On the six-party talk, because like the new, I mean, US administration was just established. We don't know how they can approach to DPRK. They can go back to strategic patience again, or some sort of a profound approach to engage with DPRK. We don't know. Also, like possible arms controls approaches can apply to DPRK. Newly, we don't know much about this. Of course, Japanese position is following the UN resolution, Security Council resolutions against DPRK. So of course, now as many experts are discussed, so how we can, bridge the concept of CBID into new realities, which DPRK already developed certain level of nuclear forces. So this kind of things should be discussed, but I don't know, the six-party talk meeting should be prioritized. Perhaps first step should be direct, bilateral meeting between perhaps Biden and Kim Jong-un. That is what be the very desirable way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think again we are looking at China, and I was hearing Dr. Zhao says international community doesn't have much leverages while dealing with North Korea. In fact, there are insinuations of Joe Biden presidency also leaning on China to revive the Iran nuclear dialogue or Iran nuclear deal. So let's see how things move in future. In August, we will of course have the 50th review conference of NPT, and TPNW is actually an outcome of these review conferences. So let's see how it moves forward. I'll now request Ms. Rita Kumari and maybe Rakesh Arya to have final set of questions unless I have missed anybody else. Yes, you can unmute yourself, Ms. Rita Kumari, and ask your question.
A very good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'm Rita, a PhD third year student of Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies, School of International Studies. Thank you very much for both the speakers for these wonderful presentations. My question is to Dr. Zhao. What are the implications of Russia-China nuclear closeness for India? Please explain. Thank you.
Okay, let
I'm
me.
sorry, can I clarify what was the
Russia-China Russia-China nuclear cooperation.
Yes, sir.
What implication this holds for India, did you say?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what implications this would hold for India in that sense because of growing proximity? So I don't know how much is happening in nuclear sector, but let's see. Dr. Zhao will answer that. Rakesh, you want to say something in the end? You want to ask something? You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you. You are not able to unmute yourself, Rakesh, so we'll have to let it go in that case. Now we can hear you.
ओके सर, अभी सुन रहे हो आप मेरे को?
जी बोलिए।
सर मैं ये मतलब थोड़ा जानकारी लेना चाह रहा था, जैसे पाकिस्तान से हम मतलब कुछ भी इशू होता है मतलब तनावपूर्ण चीजों के बारे में, तो वहाँ चीजें क्या होती है कि भाई कोई भी पॉलिटिशियन खड़ा होकर बोल देता है कि हम पापाओं के मतलब उठा के और इंडिया के ऊपर डाल देंगे, ये कि भाई वहाँ की जो जनसंख्या खत्म हो जाएगी, ये दिक्कत हो जाएगी, वो दिक्कत हो जाएगी। तो कुछ उसका कुछ है कि मतलब बैकग्राउंड है उनका, उन चीजों को कंट्रोल करने की चीजें कि भाई इस टाइप का कि एक जैसे वहाँ के जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है जो स्टैटिक कंट्रोल में नहीं है, उनको कुछ मतलब इस तरीके से मतलब करने की कोई व्यवस्था हो सकती है इस टाइप का?
Let me translate that question quickly to both our speakers. His concern is that there have been occasions of Pakistan brandishing nuclear capabilities vis-a-vis India. And are there any methods in which one can ensure certain restraint and control in such behavior of Pakistan? I would even insinuate something that he did not say. I think he's assuming that China has some influence on Pakistan that all of us know. But in general, both the speakers may respond to his question. Are there any methods in which one can put restraints on such brandishing of any nuclear weapon power? But here question is on Pakistan. I think we'll put an end to question answer session today. So this will be the last round of response from both Dr. Zhao and Dr. Nakanishim. So in case they want to add anything else in concluding remarks, feel free to do that. So let me go to Dr. Zhao first, and then we'll go to Dr. Nakanishim. Dr. Zhao.
Well, thank you so much for the questions. Ms. Kumari, your question about US-China nuclear cooperation and its implications for India. I am not aware of any direct nuclear-related cooperation between Russia and China at this moment. I think Russia is also increasingly uneasy about China's rapid nuclear modernization. So there is very little interest for Russia to help China further build up its nuclear capability. But there is certainly cooperation in nuclear-related areas, including missile defense and early warning capabilities. Russia is increasingly helping China in building up capabilities in these areas. And I think those may have some indirect implications for India. For example, missile defense. If China has a more advanced missile defense capability, in theory, China could consider deploying a missile defense network against India because, again, India has a smaller nuclear arsenal compared with China. And if Chinese missile defense capability, if the technology is advanced enough, China may be able to acquire a missile defense system that would neutralize India's small nuclear capability, and therefore undermine the credibility of Indian nuclear deterrent against China. That's a theoretical possibility. That's not to say that China has a plan to do that. But if Chinese missile defense capabilities become stronger, I think the concern on the Indian side will increase. And similarly about early warning, if with Russian assistance, if Chinese early warning systems become more powerful, China may consider shifting towards launch under attack or launch on warning nuclear postures. In fact, the US government is already accusing China of shifting towards a launch on warning by building up early warning capabilities and by deploying a larger number of vulnerable silo-based MIRVed ICBMs. If Chinese early warning becomes more capable, it provides a theoretical option for China to transition towards launch on warning. On the question about Pakistan's nuclear threat to India and how China can help, I think if you read Chinese publicly available literature, there is still a lot of concern in China about the strategic military gap between India and Pakistan, and China sees that gap as causing greater regional instability. So China feels, at least according to Chinese experts, they feel a need to further help Pakistan strengthen its strategic military capabilities and narrow that gap with India. And China sees that as a stabilizing effort. And of course, that will be seen as very troublesome in India. I think the key question here is the increasingly competitive nuclear dynamic between China and India. China is modernizing its nuclear capabilities with an eye on the United States and not paying much attention to India. But India is increasingly looking at China for deciding how much a nuclear arsenal India needs. So that asymmetrical relationship between China and India is really contributing to an increasingly unstable nuclear relationship and nuclear capability between China and India. And as India grows, I will be very quick, as India grows its nuclear capability based on the Chinese threat, it will certainly further widen the gap with Pakistan. So I think how China can help is to further appreciate and recognize Indians' threat perception about Chinese growing nuclear capability. And if China and India can do something bilaterally to address their nuclear relationship and to stabilize their nuclear relationship, maybe that will reduce India's incentive to grow nuclear capabilities, therefore making Pakistan less motivated to build up.
Thank you. Before I go to Dr. Nakanishi, I think there's a request from a participant. He is now with us. Surya Prakash Singh, you can unmute and quickly ask your question, and then we'll have Hiroaki-san answering that question.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for giving me this opportunity. So my question to Zhao, sir, hello, am I audible?
Yes, hello? Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Sir, yeah, thank you, sir. So my question is from Zhao, sir, is that, sir, we witnessed during the Cold War era that bipolarity, where there was a massive rivalry between two nuclear powers like USA and Soviet Union. And after the demise of Soviet Union, we majorly witnessed a unipolar world for a few decades, where USA was being a hegemon of power. But now we see in the current scenario in the world politics, there order is more seems to be a multipolar world. So, sir, my question is that after the Cold War era, somehow by and large USA became a very I would say very diverse multipolar. Will the countries would be able to nuclear war again? We have to switch to a unipolar world. I mean, this multipolar world would be able to prevent a nuclear war.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Zhao, very quickly, if you want to respond, the question is about preponderance of United States nuclear weapons power and how to ensure there is no nuclear war.
I really didn't hear the question clearly. There was, the voice was breaking up. I get the issue of multipolar nuclear order, and in a maybe the question is in a multiple polar system, nuclear system, how to address the threat of nuclear weapons and promote arms control. If that understanding is correct,
his question is that multilateral attempts are being made, but in reality it is still unipolar more or less, and there's a preponderance of United States nuclear assets, and in that sense it creates insecurity among other countries like China and Russia. So would it lead to nuclear weapons war is the question, or how to avoid that war?
Thank you. I think U.S. and other nuclear countries, Russia and China, they still have a shared interest. I don't think the U.S. is trying to develop nuclear primacy so that it can neutralize Russian or Chinese second strike capability. And therefore it can use nuclear weapons at ease, at its will. I don't think that's American intention. I think the major powers, including the US, they still share a common interest in maintaining a stable nuclear relationship, in maintaining strategic stability, and respecting each other's second strike capability. And if that's correct, I think there are still opportunities for the major powers to reduce their misunderstandings about each other's nuclear postures and intentions by having more substantive and extensive dialogues. With the problem is with the major power rivalry, the main countries, their societies, they are decoupling from each other. There's less communication, there's less interaction, and therefore there is more misunderstanding. I think somehow we need to reverse that trend. At least for the nuclear policy communities, we should create opportunities for more extensive dialogue so that they can realize that they do share important common interests, and there are ways to jointly and cooperatively reduce nuclear threat.
Thank you. Let's have the last concluding remarks from Dr. Hiroaki Nakanishi.
Thank you. So question was Pakistan, right? Firstly. Okay. So yeah, Pakistan, why Pakistan is developing the capability is of course against India. So perhaps the lack of communication in depth is the main fundamental problem, because like the nuclear doctrine strategies, there are many, ambiguity in the Pakistan, both Pakistan and Indian side. So this should be discussed to resolve any issues, especially to minimizing the escalatory risks, nuclear risks for both sides. That would be a mutual interest for both sides. Then it can be resolved. Then perhaps like threat you are thinking would be minimized, I believe. Perhaps like Pakistan side are wondering perhaps cold start doctrine, how can it apply to the nuclear, scenario, but perhaps this kind of things is a worry in the Pakistan side. Also in the Indian side, a proxy war scenario or another ambiguous Pakistan's nuclear doctrines. For example, first use doctrine or non-first use doctrines. This kind of posture is, in the questions. So that first step is to resolve, to discuss this both, nuclear doctrine in depth. So to minimize the gap of understanding each other, that would be a first step for resolving the issues. Perhaps, of course, Indo-Pakistan, China's, or this kind of triangle should be, should be considered, but in the bilateral context, that's the solution would be beneficial for both sides, I believe. Then another question is for the unipolar response from the US side. Of course, US is, now in the discussion of their modernization programs. Perhaps Biden is favored to minimize the role of nuclear weapons, especially discussing GBRM or ICBM or another, low air sea launch, SLBM, this kind of things should be minimized. So this kind of things is very important at this point. Or I also hope that the Biden administration could have a positive step to minimize the, at least the, doubt of the people, and also to minimize the potential nuclear risks. So that is the important. So then, so conventional weapons or US superiority in the conventional weapons should be considered, but in the nuclear context, perhaps as our Tong already explained, so that mutual interest is to enhance strategic stability. So Biden is very much keen to have a harmonized approach with them. So I think, I don't think that Biden will take a unipolar approach like Bush Jr.'s or other president took in the past. I believe multilateralism is because they are fundamental pillar. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We have gone way beyond the time that was scheduled for today's discussion. I'm delighted that we had a very, very intense and fruitful discussion, and a lot of questions came from the floor. Thank you to both the presenters, both speakers made excellent presentations. Great to know a very excellent exposition from a Chinese scholar as to how China is looking at some of these issues, because China will have an important role in shaping up the future of disarmament and nuclear arms control, which was a discussion for us today here. There is no time now for chair's concluding remarks, so I will hand over now to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal to formally propose vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. It gives me immense pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to our chair and distinguished speakers. We are really thankful to our chair, Professor Swaran Singh, for his time and chairing today's session. We are really enriched by his comment at the beginning of the session. We would also like to thank both our speakers, Dr. Hiroaki Nakanishim and Dr. Tong Zhao, for their interesting presentation. We wish to keep this dialogue going. So on behalf of NICE, I would like to propose Professor Swaran Singh and AAS that whether we could have this regular dialogue on arms control, maybe once or twice every 2 months, or maybe once, twice a month, whenever we fit. We would also like to thank our participants for their presence and their interesting questions and interventions. Thank you, everyone. Good night and stay safe.